Hi, this is Rob Deutschman, and welcome to another edition of The Old Grey Mayors. My guest today is someone that I have immense respect for. He may not have felt the love at times when we were on regional council together. I've only known him as the regional chair, but he started out as a high school teacher, later a museum director. In the 1970s, he became a councillor and mayor for the township of Woolwich. Regional chair for the region of Waterloo from 1985 to 2018, an uninterrupted run of 33 years. He retired on his own terms, having won every election he participated in. He retired the region a far better place than when he started. Most recently, he co-chaired a comprehensive review of municipal governance for the Ontario government. And despite everything that he's done in the region, I'm confident in saying that he will tell you his greatest achievement is his marriage that produced 5 children and at least 8 grandchildren.
11.
11 grandchildren. He was a mentor to me during my time on regional council. He's forgotten more about Waterloo Region and municipal governance than I will ever learn. He's my friend, Ken Seiling, and he qualifies as an old grey mayor, but he's more an old grey chair.
Well, that's great. Good to be here. And
So-
getting grayer.
So Ken, retirement has kept you quite busy, I see. The province has kept you busy. Just tell me though, how did you enjoy the process?
It was a very interesting process. Both Michael Fenn and myself, I've known Michael for a long time. Michael is probably one of the top people in the field in terms of knowledge and background and experience. Sage, wise guy who's got an encyclopedic knowledge of everything, every study that's ever been done, and
Yes.
has worked extensively. So it was sort of interesting. I was the political half of the team. He was the more bureaucratic part of the team. But he'd been a CAO within the regional system, within cities. He'd been a deputy minister. He'd been with Metrolinx.
So he was a well-qualified guy.
Well qualified, and has a long time experience with the system.
So, and I know I've always called you the historian, and I know you know where all the bodies are buried in this region. So, but we're not gonna talk about that report, and it's well documented with respect to your views on how the Ontario government has dealt with that, and we're not going to get into that. I just want to talk though. Let's go back a little bit in time. You and I first met, and I think it was about 95 or 96. When you came out to Ayr to do a little campaigning.
That's right.
You and I went knocking at a few doors. Was that the first election for a regional chair at that time?
Yeah, 1997 was the first direct election for the regional chair. The province had thrown that our way, and we were probably the second region to have a directly elected chair, and that was the first election. So enjoyed your support out in North Dumfries, and we did some canvassing out there.
Yeah. But let's go back even farther. So, you know, I've noted in the 70s you became a councillor. What year was that?
I think 1976 was the year I was elected first time.
And I'm always curious what it is that brings people to politics to become an elected, because you're out there, I guess you're a high school teacher at the time? Or were you a museum director?
By that time I had moved. I was working for the County of Wellington, so I was working within a municipal framework. I had left teaching in 74 and was working for the County of Wellington from that point on.
Okay, and it's kind of interesting because now I'm getting flashes of Ron Eddy and his experience that he's been through, but that's a former mayor of Brant County. So what was it then that brought you to politics?
So during my high school and university days, I was involved. I ran the recreation programs in Elmira and then later for Woolwich Township. And then when I began teaching, I was involved as a staff person for a summer because they were short-staffed and they had actually gotten rid of their recreation director. So I took over the programs and ran them that summer. And then ultimately I was a lay member on the recreation committee for the Township of Woolwich, and it became pretty obvious that to me that what the recreation committee was doing, you need to be an elected person on that committee to have any sway or any influence.
Right.
So I decided we had a major issue with the arena at that time, and things weren't going along as well as I thought. The arena, previously Elmira, a lot of the arenas that had after Listowel got into trouble, and so Elmira had actually gone ahead before the regulations were passed and had reinforced the arena roof and done all those.
So
sorts of things.
that was is that the one that collapsed?
The collapse in Listowel, yeah.
Yeah.
So but Elmira had done that sort of thing as a town. They'd always kept their facilities up and had done the work. But it became obvious by the early 70s that the arena needed either replacement or something else to happen with it. And we just couldn't move the ball on that particular file.
Couldn't get council to do anything.
Couldn't get council to do anything extensively. So I was on the Recreation Committee. So I thought, well, I'm going to run for council. And I have an interest in other things as well as recreation. But
Sure.
That was really what got me there in the first place. And so I then became the chair of recreation during my first term as a councillor.
Right.
And we began to move the ball a little bit and try and get some opportunities out there for doing work.
Did you get a new arena?
Well, at the end of the day, the cost of getting a new arena was pretty significant at that time,
huge.
And it was sort of ironical that every time Woolwich was doing things, they were sort of ahead of the game because they were trying to be proactive, and so every time they did something major on the facility, right after they finished doing it and paid the bill themselves, then suddenly the province come along with a grant program, so all these other communities were getting these enriched grants for doing things, but Woolwich I think was being proactive, and Elmira was being proactive. Anyway, so we actually rebuilt the entire facility.
So we have a similar path there because it was basically an arena that brought me to the mayorship at North Dumfries too, because we had that small rink and it needed to be replaced. It's kind of interesting. It always seems like I always put this proposition out there. I say, okay, look, people will, if you buy a house, you get a mortgage. And sometimes if you buy a car, you got to get a car loan, right? So you go into debt to do things.
That's right.
But when people are elected and sit at that horseshoe, suddenly it's like, I can't take on any debt, right?
Well, that's the whole debate on a lot of fronts these days, is how much debt you have. And people do forget they take mortgages out in their homes and they take loans for their cars. And somehow, but if a municipality takes on debt, some people see it as a
tragedy.
Yeah.
And it was always curious because the outside auditors would come in and as part of their report, they would say, oh, well, North Dumfries, you can take on, I don't know, it was like tens of millions of dollars of debt if you had to. And I'm like, wow, this is like unbelievable. And look at the region, for example. You've taken on debt, but you have a very high credit rating still.
Still have a AAA credit rating. And so in fact, you have to do those sorts of things if the community wants to move ahead. Otherwise, you stand still. And I think one of my big beefs with both federal and provincial governments over the years has been people that do the right things. Do them, and they pay the bill and they take on the debts, and then then people plead poverty, and government comes along and they reward poor behavior by giving grants sometimes to these things. And you've seen too many examples of that around.
Well, we did benefit from that infrastructure program when we put ours up, so I'll have to admit that it worked out really well for us. But I know what you're saying. But I want to go back to the amalgamation discussion, and we're not going to talk about amalgamation today. Okay, but what the provincial government has come out with now is and maybe you can explain it, an opportunity for municipalities to do a review. What is it the review is going to entail?
Well, they really haven't come up with guidelines yet. What they did do is when they decided to do nothing with our report, they said, well, here's a fund of money that we're going to give to municipalities that they can apply for and do efficiency studies or studies as how they can do things better. And supposedly that's where they're going to go. Right? They've already had a fund for that for the last 2 or 3 years. Some municipalities have received money to do some of these efficiency studies, and so they've increased the size of the pot, and they're hoping that municipalities will do things on their own.
And I remember when we were on council, we had that KPMG, which was an outside auditor, come in and do a review of, I don't know, it was like 10 or 11 departments or something like that. Is this the same sort of thing?
It's the same sort of thing. And as you recall, if you were on council at that time, that the KPMG came in and said, we can't find any low-hanging fruit. You're pretty efficient here. Right. And the things that they suggested you do to save money were areas the council just wasn't prepared to move, selling daycare centers and things like that.
Yeah, I think it was, they said, we could expand the daycare opportunity or increase the number of available spots or what have you, but that didn't move. But you know what? Sometimes it's important to be able to have someone come in and say, yeah, you're on the right track. Right. Yep. Especially when you're, some people don't realize the regional budget. So I was like in this two worlds when I was mayor. I was in North Dumfries, which had a $5 million annual budget. And then I'd go sit at the regional horseshoe, and it's like a $1.5 billion with a B budget. So it was like, it's a massive.
Right.
It's unbelievable how it's grown over time. I don't know if you remember, what was the budget when you first got
Quite a bit less than $1.5 billion.
So
But I think the region has always, if you take a look at the indicators, by and large, the region has always run quite efficiently, and by the indicators
Yes.
of other municipalities, it's been run very efficiently. In fact, probably some indicators would say that maybe in some cases it's been too tight in its spending, but that's in terms of administrative staff and that sort of thing.
gets back to people being extra conservative when they're
That's right.
elected. But
Well, that's what I always said about Waterloo Region has always been sort of fiscally conservative, but they've never been afraid of doing the right things and invest in the right things. And that's, you see the expressway, you see
Yep.
IN, you see the sewage treatment plants, the transit system. It hasn't been afraid of big investments if it's seen as the right way to go.
right, with some future. And I think the other thing why at the time maybe bringing someone in to take a look at things was because with the province downloading so many services, and we have the social agencies that come in all the time
Right.
trying to get some help, and we want to help them, and we have any opportunity that we can find more savings to try and spread the money to groups like that is certainly a benefit. But now let's go back in time.
Okay.
Okay. So we're going to talk about the amalgamation efforts in Waterloo Region in the past, and particularly in light of what the province is doing now, where they're saying, hey, individual municipalities, you check for efficiencies and see what you can do. And we're going to discuss about what we think about the likelihood of things happening in that regard. But before we say why we think or don't think things will happen, let's go to a historical context here.
So let me put a bit of a twist on that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't use the term amalgamation efforts. I would use the term rationalization.
Right.
Because
Okay.
that was the focus of all of the efforts over the last 20 years, was service rationalization and how we do things better.
Okay, yeah. Okay, perfect. And that probably provides the listeners with a better idea, too, in terms of where we've been and where we are today.
Right.
So the one I'm thinking about, though, is the John Sweeney
Right.
review that gets talked about. Do you call it? Was that prior to the Harris government making the recommendations for Toronto, Hamilton, Sudbury?
Right, it
Ottawa?
was. So if you go back in time, so I was elected in '85, and during that period, late '80s, I used to attend a deputy minister by the name of Gardner Church from the Ontario government was running a series of sessions where he would bring in people from the metropolitan areas of the United States and some of the metropolitan areas of Canada. And he ran these things, and he invited me to attend them. And at that time, what he was basically saying was that, and this is in the late 80s, he's saying, in a competitive world, as it was getting more competitive, was that the competition was not, Oakville versus Oshawa or Kitchener versus Waterloo or those kinds of things.
Yeah.
The competition was between regional areas. So it was the Portlands, the Munichs, the
Right.
Frankfurts,
Yeah.
the GTA, those kinds of things. That's where competition was. And so we had to better organize our local governments so that we could be stronger. So instead of simply Kitchener fighting the battle or Cambridge fighting the battle, you really had to have a larger regional area. And so that led me to the conclusion that we really need to take a look at how we were operating as a region. We'd come through the Palmer report, it had reviewed, it found things essentially working well. And
That was from Palmer was 79 or 78,
right,
79.
Right. But it really didn't deal with how we go forward
Yeah.
to the degree that I thought it
Well,
should.
and Palmer came out. It was like the region had only been formed when in
73.
So that was only like five years
experience.
post. Yeah.
Right. So there really hadn't been a lot of experience, and some of the other major regions have been 74, 75 after us. So what we began to say is, can we better organize ourselves to be more effective as a larger community if we're competing against regional communities, not individual cities or municipalities? And so at that time, to do that, we hired John Sweeney to take a look at how we could better organize and rationalize our services. And John began that project. He looked at governance and he looked at sewer and water. His major report was sewer and water.
Was this like 92, 93?
Somewhere in there, yeah.
Yeah.
And just prior to the Harris years, prior to the Harris government coming in.
Was he still in? He was. I guess he was done.
He was finished,
provincially.
right.
Yeah.
So because the Bob Rae government had come in.
Oh, okay. Right.
So the Liberal government was gone, and
Yep.
so Bob Rae was in. And so he began to look at those services. The unfortunate part is that John was doing this from a high level, But there were those people within our community who were bound determined that nothing was changing. That nothing was going to
You're
change.
talking about some elected officials?
Elected officials.
Yes, okay.
And so John ran. It got to be, I think, pretty ugly at some times. And so finally John decided he'd had enough of it. He'd issued 2, maybe 3 reports, and they weren't going anywhere. And
was there recommendations in those reports?
there were recommendations. For example, sewer and water. He recommended 1-tier sewer and water.
Right.
And that was consistent with what ultimately came out of the Walkerton inquiry. There were lots of reports
About,
on that.
yeah, right, right.
So anyway,
and we all know the problem that occurred with Walkerton and the loss of lives. Yeah.
Anyway, so that ended. The Harris government came in, and the Harris government then decided there were too many municipalities in Ontario. There were 800 and some at that time, and they decided there was more.
Yes.
And so there were areas where reform. We obviously had been a hotbed of discussion about municipal reform, regional reform in the region because of the Sweeney area and the things that we were doing at that particular time. Hamilton was another one, Ottawa, Sudbury, some of the other ones. And so
just before Harris government, though, I just want to focus on Sweeney. Okay, and what went on there. So John Sweeney was meeting with the various municipalities, public meetings. What was going on?
He had public meetings. He had an office in our building, but he had an independent office with staff, and he met with people, consulted with people, not only within the region but provincially and otherwise. And he tabled his reports. As I say, the major one that came out was on the sewer and water because we had a split system here. Yeah.
So what was the system that we had? 3 cities had their own?
So the system that was put in place in 73 was there were the early regions, which were York, Niagara, and Waterloo, had a double system. So that the region did sewage treatment, they did water supply, but the retailing of it was left at the lower tier at the area municipal level.
Okay.
So when the regions were created the year after us, the province said, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done this, we shouldn't have split them. So all the regions created from 74 on had a unified system, so you could plan and do everything jointly. It made life a lot simpler for doing this thing, but it wasn't done. So there was a move afoot, which was subsequently reinforced by the Walkerton inquiry later on to bring them back together. So that was his major report, and he recommended that we unify the system.
So water and sewer, what about fire services at that time?
They never really got down to fire services. I think before we got into further services, John sort of called it quits, and we wound it down.
Why? Okay, so he called it quits because why?
I think there were some people who were pretty visceral in their approach to it.
Right.
I think it wasn't a very pleasant time for John, and there didn't seem to be a lot of support outside some of us within the regional framework who wanted to see any kind of reform.
So the cities and the townships were not?
There wasn't a big uptake, let me put it that way.
Okay. So was sewer and water the only recommendation, or were there other recommendations in that report?
He had made some recommendations, and I should have brought them along on elections and things like that, which I don't remember all the exact terms. But they led ultimately to some other changes that came on after that. But he came to a halt after that.
So, but did anything happen within the region following the Sweeney report, like efforts to try and do something?
Nothing came out of that other than the fact that ultimately when we dealt with the provincial government, the separated council came about, direct election of the regional chair, and those are things that he was pointing to through his work.
So these things happened after Harris started?
Yep.
So now Sweeney ends, John Sweeney stops his review, and nothing comes of that.
Right.
And then what happens then?
The Harris government comes in.
Yes.
And the Harris government decides there's too many municipalities, they want changes in the structure. And so they decide they do 2 things. One is they create a list of municipalities in which they're going to send commissioners into under the Municipal Act to review governance structure. And so there was an A list and a B list.
Okay, yeah.
And so Hamilton, Ottawa, Sudbury,
Toronto.
Toronto had been done already.
Okay.
In that process. Toronto it was done as a unilateral decision before that time.
Okay. Unilateral by Toronto or by the government?
By the government.
Okay.
The government decreed
because I'd be surprised if a decision at the municipal level to do something.
No, there had been huge debate in Toronto. There was a Metro chairman, and then there was the area mayors, and they had this huge debate. And so Harris was the premier. Al Leach was the Minister of Municipal Affairs at that time.
Yeah.
And that debate went on for some months, and finally the province unilaterally decided that they were going to amalgamate them. So
Waterloo Region was on the B list.
So when the list ultimately to the rest of the province came out, we thought we were on the A list.
Right. So the A list was the announcement of those areas that were going to be amalgamated.
They were going to have a commissioner appointed.
Okay. All right.
And the B list was those who were told, get busy and do something, or we'll do something.
Okay. So the ones that had the commissioner, ultimately, all of them
Went single tier, with the exception of Haldimand Norfolk, which, for a variety of political reasons, instead of going single tier, it was split back into the original counties, and create two single tier counties.
Okay.
They had been a two-tier amalgamated two counties.
Right.
And we won't get into today what happened there, but it was
Yeah,
a political solution down there. But they were single-tier cities
Right.
created.
Okay, so let's talk about us on the B list. So, but just as an aside, interesting story then, why don't you tell us, why did you think you were on the A list? How did we end up on the B list?
Well, every indication that I had was that we were on the A list. We thought we were number 1 or 2 on the A list because of the amount of work had gone on, the arguments and the fighting and the
Sweeney
report,
yeah.
all those sorts of things had been there, and we were sort of thinking that we were there. I never saw the list, but the day that was announced,
You went down to Queen's Park.
there was an announcement in Toronto. I think it was during AMO or some. I was in Toronto when the thing was announced, and I was flabbergasted. I was absolutely flabbergasted
That you were not
we were
on
not
the
on the
A
A
list.
list.
And so the A list would have been a commissioner coming in to do
Yes.
a review?
a review and make recommendations.
Okay.
And I went around and talked to all the senior people that I knew in the government at that day.
What did they tell you?
And they said, you know why you're not on the A list. And I said, tell me. And they'd say, you know.
So you didn't know.
So I suspected, but which I later had confirmed
Years later.
sometime later by a member of the government.
Yeah. So what can you say in broad terms happened?
I would say that there was some political intervention that had us.
From local?
Well, I won't say from where, but we had some political intervention that had us move from the A list to the B list.
Okay, I'll say I've heard local involvement in moving us from one list to the other, and I'll leave it at that as well.
Okay.
You didn't say it, I said it. So now we're on the B list. What happens then?
So I have to get my timing right here, but the B list was told, get busy and do something, or we might possibly come back and do something. So that's about the time that the area municipalities, fearful of amalgamation, we've been trying for probably 5 or 6 years to say there's a portion of our act that said we could do transit if we wanted to, but nobody wanted us to act on it, because you remember there was a Cambridge system and there was a Kitchener system, which Waterloo
I don't
was
really
attached
remember,
to.
but I understand.
So for 5 or 6 years, they kept promising they'd find a way of creating a link between Cambridge and the north end of the region.
Yeah.
They never did it.
Who's the they?
The 3 cities.
Okay.
The 2 cities, basically. And so when this threat of a potential amalgamation came along, the cities decided that they would throw up a couple of things to show that we were moving in the direction of greater
When you say throw
rationalization.
up, move up to the
Move to
region.
the region, right.
Okay.
So that's how transit came up to the region, at the same, and garbage collection.
Oh, okay.
Came up to the region at that time.
Right.
They were voluntarily offered up.
Yeah.
And to show that we were moving in the right direction.
Yeah, this speaks to, and you've said, I'll give you credit for this, that amalgamation may happen, but it's by evolution.
It could be by evolution.
Over time. Like, it's not going to happen by revolution. It's not going to happen by local decision, but as a one-off on everything, but individual services over time eventually moving to the region.
Ultimately, it could happen that way.
Yeah.
It's
That's been the history so far, right?
so far, yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the Harris government did that. They came in and they also downsized councils, and so they actually came in '97. They gave us a direct election of regional chair, and then regional council asked for the council to be separated. From 2000, the regional council was separated.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. There must have been some opposition to that locally.
Well, there were some people who didn't like it.
Yeah.
who thought that they and local councillors should control the regional council.
Because that's how it was prior to. We have now directly elected, like all the mayors are on regional council, but we have directly elected representatives from the three cities.
Right.
And before it was, if you were elected a alderman or a councillor from the city, some of them would then move up to regional council.
And sit on both councils.
Yeah. What was the problem with that?
Well, first of all, the region was their secondary business. You know, I still remember people arriving, opening their envelopes at committee meetings, or saying, well, I need to know what my local council thinks about this before I can deal with this issue. I mean, by and large, things moved along, but they weren't focused on their issues, and so there weren't particularly champions for things, having a regional frame or a regional focus for things.
Right.
And so I'll say to this day that we wouldn't have an LRT today if we didn't have separated councils.
Yeah.
Because we got champions for the land use planning, champions for the tools to create the land use planning, which became the transit system. So. And Niagara is the only one that had to separate a council up to that point in time, and so we were the second ones. But the government did that, then used the opportunity then to downsize the council too.
So I want to get into the weeds on something here, because you've mentioned this concept of the triple majority and what that was all about. Tell me what that was about. What were the votes going on? What was happening locally here? Because I think it speaks to just how difficult it is to make the change, whether it's rationalization of services or an amalgamation, coming from the bottom up.
Right.
And I think this gives a good example, especially here in Waterloo Region, where we seem to get along quite well. But on these issues, if we can't make it happen, it's hard to see how anyone's going to make it happen.
That's right. So triple majorities was a convenient tool that the government threw in some 20 years ago into the legislation to allow for transfer of services. But the reality is you have to have the majority of the municipalities, the majority of the population to vote for it. And so we had a package for regional reform in 2000, I think it was, where we were very close to having a commissioner come in at that point in time, because we'd reached a stalemate in the discussions.
Yeah, let me just ask you, so in 2000, this was part of the B-list work that was going on?
Right.
So in 2000, then you had a package. What was the package?
Well, the package had a number of things, but the biggest thing was the one-tier sewer and water.
Okay.
That was an important thing to achieve, and there were things in there that we agreed to discuss. For example, there'd always been a push for the region to take on Centre in the Square, for example, to cost that because it was providing a regional function.
Right.
Look at there were a variety of smaller
City
items.
Kitchener would be happy to move that one up, I guess.
In part. Some were and some weren't. But the sewer and water was the major part of it.
So let me just ask you, the sewer and water keeps coming up. Why would that be a difficult one to move to the region?
Well, I think the area municipalities think that a lot of their public works departments are constructed around being able to doing the road function plus the sewer and water function. And in Kitchener, they actually have a gas utility, which is woven into that as well. So they would lose some critical mass in terms of their own staffing if in fact the function moved up.
But wouldn't there be a cost savings to just move it on up, or was there a fear that there wasn't going to be a cost savings?
I think the issue for them more was we're going to lose critical mass in our workforce. And
what's the issue with that? Because they're going to reduce their, or it wasn't going to reduce overall their costs.
So I think they saw, for example, if they were doing local street replacements, that it would be another level going brought in. Because right now, if they do street replacements on the local street, they just do it themselves. They do the road work, they do the sewer and water,
right,
and that sort of thing, which is the reverse of what we are now. All of our major arterial roads, every time there's a road project on there, we now have to coordinate everything with the area municipalities.
Yeah, so area and the region.
And the region, yeah. So anyway, but that from a planning perspective, so things were happening, like, for example, the whole idea with regional services originally was that when the province did it, they wanted to manage the larger scale growth. So in the regions that followed us, for example, they could move water and sewage between municipalities as they needed. So let me give you an example. So in the stockyards in the north end of Waterloo, which is in Woolwich Township, when they wanted to develop the facilities there, they had to negotiate with the city of Waterloo, because even though the region supplied the water and treated the sewage, they had to come through city of Waterloo pipes, and so the Woolwich Township had to enter into these negotiations with Waterloo, and quite frankly, at the time, I thought they held them up for ransom, but But they have the ability to block developments
Right,
in
right,
areas
right, right.
where there could be proper development. So
Yeah.
you don't have that issue in Peel or Halton or Durham.
So that's one of the difficult situations we have to deal with here.
Right.
So in
so
2000,
another example I'll
Yeah.
give you is that. So when we're doing water conservation, we one of the tools of water conservation is block rates for water usage. The region has never been able to use that tool because area municipalities control the retail water rates at the end of the day. So you can't have a common water rate.
Right,
You have a
right.
common wholesale rate, but not a common retail rate.
Well, I'm no in North Dumfries. I was happy to have the region just take over control of that, and because we just didn't have the professional staff to deal with those issues.
Right. And so, people have dirty water. Who did they call? They called the region. Is it a source issue or is it a local pipe issue?
Right, right.
So it's just lines of accountability.
So back in 2000, then you had this package, and was this a package that was worked out amongst all the municipalities?
Right. So we went through this exercise led by somebody from the city of Kitchener, who
A counselor.
who
Yeah.
promoted this, and there was
Yeah.
called a Breakfast Club group that were opposing one-tier government, and
So there's
but opposing the packaging.
Were they a
for
group of
whatever.
counselors from the various
Municipalities who got together and said,
Yeah.
well, let's have one more, rather than bring in a commissioner, let's have one more effort to do a local package. And so we came up with this package.
When you say one more due, what was the prior due? The Sweeney report, or what was the prior effort? You said one more due.
Well, so we had come to a end of the road in terms of trying to find a package at that time.
Oh.
So we were at the point where perhaps it was time for a commissioner to come in and do the work because there wasn't enough local consensus to do something.
So the local municipalities couldn't come to an agreement on anything.
With the region, yeah.
And so you were at one point almost prepared to go to the province and say, bring in a
Yeah,
commissioner.
Right.
And how did that go? Was there a vote for that?
Well, there wasn't because we never got to the vote. It was just a matter of counting votes around the table and to see where we were at, and we were pretty close to that. And so this group formed itself and met and outside of the region,
Yeah.
and said, let's have one more go at it. And so we convened and went through this exercise and come up with this package.
Yes.
But when it came to the vote at regional council, it failed by one vote because the Kitchener councillors and some others who wanted one tier voted against it. And their argument for voting against it was, we want one-tier government. We don't want
One tier, that's it.
one tier.
Even though you had negotiations on a package, that
Mm-hmm.
was actually, and you wouldn't have put it to a vote if you didn't think you had a good chance.
Right.
So what shocked you about that?
Well, I had two rural mayors who voted against it, who I thought were firmly on side, and I hadn't bothered spending time with them. And because at the end of the day, they said, well, we support one-tier government. So
And today, it's interesting because if you polled the 4 rural mayors now, not one of them would support one-tier government.
no.
Because it's always been this view, we want to be able to decide what we want to do locally, but we still have the benefit of the big brother, big sister,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, but the region to take care of everything you're doing.
Yeah.
So that was the shocker. So those 2 votes basically
If 2 votes had gone the other way, we would
would have had these services.
Yeah.
So that failed. Did the province, how did it end up with the province then?
Well, shortly after that time, Harris retired and Eves took over as premier, and Eves was getting ready to go for election, and he wanted to throw some oil in the waters, and so he sent Chris Hodgson, who was the new Minister of Municipal Affairs, out, and quite frankly, shut down all regional reform. Basically said, he publicly, quite frankly, he humiliated everybody publicly who was in supporter of reform,
Yeah.
and said, get along, play well, but we're out of the reform game.
So it seems like now that's interesting because the analogy to that would be what's going on today almost. I mean, you don't have to comment on it, but
Yeah.
I'll just say it seems like now with the current government and the backtracking that's happened on various issues, which is all out there in the public, it seems like there's a bit of a backtrack going on with respect to the amalgamation talks,
Right.
or the municipal review that's happened. And now, in order to appease everyone and make everyone happy, because the general response is, hey, we're happy they're not going ahead with everything, which maybe you're happy today, but 10 years from now, you're going to take a look back on this and say, we should have did more. But politics is what's come into play.
Right. I don't disagree with you at all.
Interesting. So it's kind of come full circle on that issue. Let me just ask you, and I'm going to have you back, Ken, if you don't mind, for future shows, because there's so many things we could talk about, right? But any regrets on that issue back then on the vote, and what maybe you should have done differently to make the change happen that you had hoped would happen at that time?
No, I thought we had played out. As in my only hindsight is 2 votes that I never thought were at risk.
Yeah, because I've always known
always
you.
been on side.
You've been one to be well prepared and know what's happening going into a vote.
Right.
So
those took me totally by surprise.
Yeah.
Because they had been totally on side all the way through. So, any rate.
Well, listen, Ken, I want to thank you for coming in today. It's only a 30-minute podcast, but 30 minutes with you doesn't do justice to anything. But just want to say it was a pleasure having you here today.
Great.
And I know you'll probably be busy with other things, particularly within Waterloo Region, and I look forward to having you back to discuss some of those things, not only the past that we talked about, but also your views on the future for Waterloo Region. Because if there's anyone who's well positioned to provide us with that opinion, it's you. And so again, thanks. And
happy to come back.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks
Great.
a lot.
Good.
So this ends another edition of the Old Grey Mayors. And as usual, if you have any questions or issues or interest, or someone that you think might be someone we should speak to on a future podcast, please feel free to reach out on me through Twitter or whatever other form, and more than happy to see how we can accommodate. Thanks again for listening.